So I'd just like to thank everybody, as other speakers have done, for coming out today. And I know there's not many of us, but it is important that as many voices as possible are raised as often as possible to say no to the bank bailouts, no to the bailouts of wealthy property developers, and no to the attacks on our living standards and to cuts in public services. But above all, we need to be saying no to the notion that we should all be sharing the economic pain. And we need to be saying very loudly, they didn't share the wealth, so we're not going to share the pain. This financial crisis, it is important to point out, was not caused, despite what we are told day after day, it was not caused by a failure of regulation, and it was not caused by a failure of political leadership. And neither will it be solved by better regulation or by electing new or different political leaders. Fianna Fáil politicians are very fond of telling us we are where we are. This is what they say in response to questions about the cause of the economic crisis. And it's an attempt by them to avoid any analysis of the causes of the crisis and the policies that led us to where we are. But what we need to say is we are where we are, not so much because of the specific policies of the current or previous governments, although quite obviously they contributed very handsomely to the suddenness and severity of the crash. But more importantly, we are where we are because of the economic and political system called capitalism. We are where we are because of the political and economic system that rewards greed and avarice, that lauds as successes those who make for themselves more and more wealth, rather than those who contribute to the good of society. In Irish terms, this is a system that for the last 10 to 15 years has hailed as heroes people like Shawnee Fitz, Michael Pingleton, Liam Carroll, Sean Dunn and all the rest. And when the economic commentators now talk of these people as the pariahs that they like to make out they are, we need to remember that they were the people that were talked to any time that there was an analysis needed. They were the people that were held up as the heroes of how a society should be run. This is a system in Irish terms in which 1% of the population owns 34% of the wealth. And in global terms, in which half of the world's population, or over 3 billion people, live on less than €2 a day. So capitalism, quite clearly, is a system based on the concept of a minority having control over the majority, driven by the lust for power rather than a desire to satisfy human needs. It cannot guarantee economic security because the boom and bust cycle is integral to it. But, as we've seen quite clearly, when the boom comes, one section of the population, the wealthy, gains disproportionately. In Ireland's Celtic Tiger, there was a huge transfer of wealth from ordinary people and from spending on public services into the pockets of the very, very wealthy. Last year, for example, when the bust comes along, after the boom finishes, it's not that same section of the population that's expected to pay. It's the ordinary people who have to pay. Last year, it's a really interesting figure to take note of. The number of Ireland's high net worth individuals, that's people who have investable assets of more than $1 million, rose by over 10% to 18,100. And the number of ultra high net worth individuals, those with investable assets of more than $30 million, rose to 181. So clearly, it's not a recession for everyone, and clearly not everyone is sharing the pain. Worldwide, it's worth noting that total global wealth values rose last year by 18.9% to 39 trillion. So a recession clearly does not mean that there's less money in the world. It just means that there's less money to go around for ordinary workers. The wealthy have sucked more and more of it into their greedy paws. And when the executives in Irish Bank tell us that 22 billion has disappeared into a black hole and will never be seen again, we need to ask whose bank account is at the bottom of that black hole. As another speaker said earlier, the money wasn't taken out into O'Connell Street and burned. The money hasn't disappeared. It's been stolen from workers' pay packets and from the budgets for public services, and it's been given to some of these ultra-high net worth individuals. So this is not a system that can be regulated into improvement, and it's not a system whose rules can be tweaked into being fairer or being more equal in any really meaningful extent. Economic decisions are not actually made by regulators or politicians. The real political and economic decisions are made by the so-called financial markets, whose supposed wisdom is parroted unquestioningly by so-called independent commentators and economists. How many times, for example, have you heard RTE's economics correspondents repeat the term, we have to see how the markets react? With the financial markets, all it is shorthand for speculators and gamblers. People who don't contribute anything to society, but through their speculation and gambling, they attack the living standards of ordinary working class people. And right across Europe and further afield at the moment, the markets are demanding a slashing of public spending and a dismantling of workers' rights and conditions. And because economic orthodoxy has accepted that the markets cannot be challenged, these profiteers are being appeased by government policies in every EU country. So it's not enough to be talking about sacking the current government and replacing them with a new one. We can kick out Brian Cowan, we can replace him with Enda Kenny, we can replace him with Eamon Gilmore, we can even replace him with Joe Higgins. But even if they wanted to do so, no politician is going to be allowed to exert any real control over the markets. If we want to make sure that this financial crisis and the economic misery that has visited upon us is the last, then what we need to do is we need to begin to organise, not to change the way in which capitalism is administered, but to tear down capitalism and replace it with a system which puts the needs of the many above the greed of the few. The challenge for every one of us that's here today, by our presence, by coming on this demonstration today, and by turning up on other demonstrations, we have shown that we believe that a new way of running society is needed. So our challenge now is to become organisers of that new society, in our workplaces, in our communities, in our trade unions and everywhere. We need to organise to oppose the attacks on our class and to sweep away the system and replace it with one based on justice, fairness and equality. And the real challenge we have to do is begin to imagine what that new society might look like. Because it's relatively easy for us all to agree that we're opposed to the way that things are. It's easy to say that we don't accept the analysis that there is no alternative. But the harder challenge for every one of us is to begin to imagine and to articulate what that alternative actually is. What is the new alternative that we want to replace the current society with? And that's the challenge, and if we leave it to others, then others will step into the breach and a new ruling class elite will emerge. So we need to get together and we need to begin a discussion and an imagining of how a society which would have social justice, equality and real democracy at its core, what that will look like. Let's begin that type of conversation and let's imagine a society and let's start the process of building that new society. Thank you very much.